Hi, I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. We're about just a week away from the first nominating contests in this year's presidential races in Iowa, the Iowa caucuses. They take place February 1. Here to bring us an up-to-date look at them is Josh Kraushaar, political editor of the National Journal and author of the weekly column Against the Grain. He's also the former editor-in-chief of The Hotline, one of my favorite publications, and former political correspondent at Politico. How are you doing?
Good, very good. Good
Thanks
to be here, Jim.
Joining us. It's, I wouldn't say an exciting time. It's actually a weird time for politics in America, because I think that it has, I can remember a year ago, it was the Bush-Clinton race. It was inevitable. And it's everything but right now.
The establishment in both parties is as powerless as it's ever been to shape the trajectory of these primaries and the nomination fight. And you're seeing that on the Republican side with Donald Trump and Ted Cruz leading in both the national polls and almost all the early state races as well. And on the Democratic side, where new polling is showing Bernie Sanders with a commanding lead over Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire, and even polling in Iowa, where Hillary Clinton is looking to the state as a firewall to do well in the rest of the nominating contests. She's now trailing in some polls in Iowa against Bernie Sanders as well.
I want to ask you about the polls in general, but well, let's look at a couple of them. Let's look at that 33. Here's the Iowa one. This is the Monmouth one. It's 48-39. There's another one that actually has them tied. And then here's a New Hampshire one, the one you just mentioned, which has Bernie up 60-33. The polls have gotten flaky. You go from poll to poll, there's virtually no consistency in them. What is accounting for that? Is it simply, I'm not doing any domestic polling right now. My brother's actually not, he's staying away from presidential polling as much as he can. He does a little bit of it. But it's really hard to get good numbers.
Yeah, part of the problem that pollsters are having is finding out who's going to show up to vote.
Yeah.
And especially when we look at the dynamic of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, a lot of their supporters like their candidates' personalities. They certainly, in the case of Trump, know him. They go to his rallies, but they often aren't registered to vote, or they don't know how to caucus in the case of Iowa. So you see this great disconnect between the voters that are sampled in a certain poll and the ones that are most likely to vote or have voted in a primary or caucus. So, like, for example, CNN came out with a poll this week showing Cruz trailing Trump in Iowa by a significant margin, but it assumes that you're going to have all these people that say they're going to vote, they're actually going to show up. The polls that have tighter screens, the ones that actually measure people who have voted in the caucuses before, they actually show Ted Cruz doing better. And likewise on the Democratic side, Clinton does much better when the polls have tighter screens. The ones that assume that there's going to be higher turnout show Bernie Sanders doing better. So it really is about the methodology and trying to figure out who's going to show up on an Iowa caucus.
It's also about the call, the responses on phone calling. Quinnipiac still does phoning, and then a group like ARG or PPP are doing online, right. And it's an entirely different pool of people that you're surveying, and so it's become, and yet we find ourselves going up and down in these numbers and who's up, who's down, but I think it's pretty much a guessing game right now. What we know is that we got a contest.
Right, we know we have a contest, and we know in Iowa it's between Cruz and Donald Trump. Yeah. We know that Sanders has the momentum in New Hampshire, and it's a very, very close race in Iowa. I like to say sometimes actions speak louder than the polls.
Yeah.
When you see Hillary Clinton this week going after Bernie Sanders for the first time in very, very aggressive ways, it strongly suggests that her campaign knows that these polls are accurate and that he really is a very serious threat to her in those first two primary states. Likewise, when Ted Cruz goes after Donald Trump, saying he has New York values, as he did at the debate in South Carolina, it shows that Cruz realizes Trump is his most serious threat.
So what was going to be no contest now turns out to be a real contest, and I want to ask you first about the Hillary Clinton side of that. There was a sense that this was inevitable, and now it may not be. What happens if Bernie wins Iowa and then turns around and wins New Hampshire? Well, from my experience, all the polling that we have in the later states doesn't matter, because once the table gets set, as we've seen, as we saw with the Obama victory, as we saw with the John Kerry victory, is that that has a dynamic all its own. All the later states then end up getting caught up in this sweep, the bump as it's called. Could this happen to her, or is her ground game so strong in these other states that she still can survive and is the inevitable winner?
It's less about the ground game, if Hillary can recover after losses, if she loses Iowa and New Hampshire, and more about the demography of the upcoming states. And Iowa and New Hampshire are among the most white Democratic states. The electorate in those caucuses and primaries are about as white and as liberal as you'll find in any of the other contests. After the Iowa and New Hampshire races, you've got Nevada, and you've got South Carolina. Nevada, where Hispanics play a significant role in their state's caucuses, and in South Carolina, which is a majority African-American electorate. Hillary Clinton is beating Bernie Sanders by about 60 points with non-white voters, non-white Democratic voters. So the question is, you view this as a race of momentum, and if Hillary loses against all odds to Bernie Sanders in both Iowa and New Hampshire, does that mean people are going to think she's a losing horse and she's not the strongest candidate that people thought, and they'll go with Bernie Sanders? Or do we see this demographic divide? What we're seeing in the Democratic Party, especially these days, identity speaks as much about how people vote as policy. And my hunch is that even if Hillary Clinton does poorly, she'll still have a firewall in those Nevada and South Carolina races, just because the demographics of the electorate are so much different than in Iowa and New Hampshire.
There is the issue of the emails. The Inspector General, there was a leak in the Inspector General report that talked about a dozen or so top secret emails that had gone on her private account. She accused them, the Inspector General, of serving as a shill for the Republicans, even though that Inspector General was appointed by Barack Obama. The question is this going to haunt her from now till the end of this election, or is this an issue that she's already overcome and is not going to be around to bother her?
It depends whether she's indicted, and I think that's a very real possibility given the latest leaks that are coming out from, like you said, a Democratic appointee who's the Inspector General of the intelligence community. This is not something that you can brush off as just a political attack. There's an investigation going on, and where it leads will determine what happens. Now, some people think that this Obama White House, are they going to actually, are they going to push, if they do find something, will they push the Department of Justice not to prosecute? We don't know that, and we don't know what's going to happen and what they're finding. But these leaks indicate she is at very serious risk of some kind of legal jeopardy in the middle of a presidential campaign. And if you're Joe Biden or if you're Bernie Sanders, boy, I mean, if Sanders does well in Iowa, New Hampshire, and then you have news about further legal issues that she could face, that's a big red flag. And Joe Biden, the party there are a lot of superdelegates at play for the Democrats, and they're still filing deadlines much later on the primary calendar. If something does happen in the not too distant future, I would not entirely rule out the possibility that Joe Biden
I was going to ask you
could
about
be
that.
tapped in.
I was thinking of the Gene McCarthy 68, which after drawing blood in Iowa led to first Bobby Kennedy coming in, tragically assassinated, but created the opening for Johnson to leave and Hubert Humphrey to succeed him. Is there a waiting in the wings, another candidate? I mean, there have been those who talked about the fact that there was no Democratic bench. There is a bench. It's just that the bench was hesitant to play because they didn't want to run up against Hillary. Is there a chance that the bench could actually get in the game?
Well, here's the big difference between 1968 and now. Democrats still like Hillary Clinton. Her favorables among Democrats are very solid, if not strong, but they're very good. And Democrats, the most partisan Democrats, really don't buy any of they don't believe that she really, they don't hold it against her with how she's handled the email server. Her trust numbers overall are very poor, but among Democrats, they're still adequate.
But there's a lot of Democrats who say she's not the one who's actually gonna. There are people hesitating to get in. There's a lot of superdelegates who haven't committed, and a lot of big Democratic donors haven't stepped into the picture either. They were hoping that Joe Biden would, he didn't. So you have a contest between Hillary Clinton, who is liked but not loved, and Bernie Sanders, who is loved by some, but not liked by a lot of folks in the establishment of the party. It's not exactly the choice that people were looking for, and that's why some were looking to Joe Biden. Is there a chance that this thing still gets mixed up before we're out of it?
Well, like I said, I think it depends if she's indicted. Absent an indictment, if we just have leaks that aren't, there's no bombshell of massive proportions, I don't think the trajectory of the Democratic race will change. I still think Sanders is going to be a very serious competitor, as we're seeing, but I don't think any other candidates will jump in. If she's indicted, though, I mean, panic would set in, and the prospect of getting a Joe Biden from the sidelines.
Losing 2 states isn't going to do it.
Losing 2 states. Now, if Joe Biden was going to jump in, he would have jumped in October. I mean, he may be regretting his decision.
My brother has a piece in the Wall Street Journal this week saying if OMalley gets up to 15% in Iowa, and he and Bernie hold Hillary into the low 40s, look for something to mix it up. Is that not enough?
OMalley is not even close to 15%, and we're only a couple weeks away from the Iowa caucuses. Martin OMalley doesn't have the money, frankly, to sustain a campaign beyond New Hampshire. If he doesn't do double digits.
Why didn't he catch on? I've watched him in the debates. He certainly is a compelling speaker. I've seen him in a couple times up close, and he looks good. There were those who thought that this is a guy who actually is an up-and-comer. Why didn't it happen?
Bernie Sanders has stolen all the energy from the left and from the anti-Clinton progressive forces within the party. And OMalley sort of prepared his final couple years as governor of Maryland with a panoply of liberal legislative accomplishments, hoping that would be the case he would be making against Clinton. But instead, we have a 74-year-old rumpled Vermont senator who's making that case much more authentically and effectively.
Explain that to me. How did the angry grandfather end up being the guy who has captured the youth vote?
Our politics today are about style, not substance. And if a Bernie Sanders speech where he, with his Brooklyn accent is ripping up the capitalist system, Goldman Sachs, Wall Street, it contrasts greatly with O'Malley's much more executive approach. And O'Malley, I've seen him on the campaign trail. He just doesn't exude the same amount of charisma and energy that Sanders, who looks more authentic and frankly is much more progressive and much more liberal than O'Malley ever has been.
Democrats worried about down ballot if Bernie is the candidate. Is there a chance that Bernie is the candidate? And if he is the candidate, what happens down ballot?
Well, both parties are worried about it. There were stories in the last couple of weeks in the New York Times with party leaders on both sides panicked about the prospect of their current frontrunners being the Sanders and in the case of Cruz and Trump on the Republican side being the nominees. What happened? I still think Sanders is unlikely to end up with a nomination, but it could be a much more protracted fight than anyone had any reason to expect. Why is Sanders still a long shot, even if he wins Iowa and New Hampshire? Because the composition of the electorate, the demographic composition, is much more diverse, and Clinton just had, if you look at the poll, even in 2008, right, when Obama was the underdog and looked like he was still an unlikely frontrunner before Iowa, he still was winning 25 to 35% of the African-American vote and of the Hispanic vote. Sanders is much lower than that at this point, and we're already 2 weeks before Iowa. So I don't know if he can turn that around.
What the Obama strategy was the 12 caucus states that came after Super Tuesday that he rolled and won rather decisively, locking up the nomination long before Hillary Clinton even knew what hit her. Do you know, or do you have a sense of, has the Clinton campaign modeled itself after that? I mean, are they playing in the far down the road states, or is no one yet focused on the states that will be in play sometime in April and May?
Both campaigns are well organized beyond the first 4 states. But the challenge for Sanders, Obama, when he won Iowa, proved that an African-American candidate could win a very white liberal caucus, and that was against early expectations. Sanders will need to show that he can't. Caucuses are to Sanders, play to Sanders' advantages. He actually could end up winning a lot of these caucuses because they're comprised of mainly activists that are much more liberal than the rest of the party. The big question is, can Sanders win a state like, say, Virginia? Or can he win a southern state? Or can he win a state outside of his comfort zone? That's going to be the big test for Sanders, to see whether he can broaden his appeal beyond the most progressive and young college kid element.
Well, we've
of
taken the
party.
first half of the show trying to show that a not exciting race could actually be exciting. Now let's look at the really exciting, almost crazy race with Donald Trump getting an endorsement this week from Sarah Palin, and then also appearing at Liberty University, where this thrice divorced New Yorker with very different value system almost gets endorsed by Jerry Falwell's son. What do you make of this? Well, let's talk about the Christian endorsement, not quite endorsement, but close. And the Sarah Palin endorsement.
Well, there's a divide within the populist conservative wing of the party that both Trump and Cruz are fighting for. And the most remarkable takeaway from this past week is that Cruz has finally, after months of claiming he loves Donald Trump, they would say the negative thing about him, has taken the gloves off and has started to attack his values, and also saying he Donald Trump is actually part of the establishment. That's the new attack line from the Cruz campaign this week. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty remarkable turn from, and a pretty remarkable line of attack, calling Donald Trump, who's about as anti-establishment as they come, actually the guy that the donors and some of the party leaders are warming up to. For Trump going to Liberty, I don't think that was a big success, to be honest with you. I was in South Carolina last week. I got to see both of them. And the evangelical vote in South Carolina is significant, makes up about 2/3 of the Republican vote. Cruz has got an early advantage with the most religious voters. Trump has some support, but when ultimately the ads go on the air in South Carolina and these other states, and you actually have to look at all the negative information as well as the positive buzz, I got to think that Cruz in Iowa and in the more conservative states thereafter will have an advantage with the socially conservative voters.
Let's look at the polling data that we have. We have an Iowa poll and a New Hampshire poll. Let's put them up and see what they look like. This is a New Hampshire primary poll, which shows Trump up rather decisively. There was a poll that had Kasich at 20%.
Yeah.
What do you make of that one?
Well, there are outliers, to be sure. Some polls are outliers. Kasich has been anywhere from 6% to 20%. If you go to his events, he's clearly getting a little bit of momentum. But the real problem for Republicans.
And he's got the Sununu support, which is also big in New Hampshire.
Sununu, Tom Rath, he has a good organization. The problem for the so-called establishment lane is that it's all backed up. You have Rubio, Jeb, Christie, and Kasich all fighting for the same votes, while Trump and even Cruz are locking down their own lane of supporters that are different from the more establishment candidates. So, you look at the numbers, and you have 14, 10, 10, and 6 for Chris Christie in that poll. I mean, they're all splitting the same voters, and they're cannibalizing the more moderate vote and allowing a much more populist conservative candidate like Donald Trump to run away with this thing.
Let's take another look at another poll. I think this is an Iowa one. And this has Trump up by 1 over Cruz. We have a lot of volatility in the Iowa polls, but all of them pretty clear about the fact that it is a Trump-Cruz contest. The question I have is this: we're looking at them splitting the conservative / Tea Party vote. But the mainstream conservative vote, which is the establishment vote, is split among a larger pool of people. There are those who suggest that when you get to the less red states, you're going to have an opportunity for the Jeb Bush, the John Kasich, the maybe Chris Christie's to rise. Do we even get that far? I mean, this is a situation where if Trump rolls in the first 3, does it not create significant enough momentum that can carry him through?
Yeah, I mean, Jim, that was my theory. The fact that you may have Trump leading or in the early states, but once you get one moderate or center-right candidate, they'll have an opportunity as you get further down the line and the states become more moderate. Super Tuesday states, or winner-take-all states, are in much more bluer or swing state territory. The problem with that, I'm starting to question my own original theory because Trump is actually looking more and more favorable, is seen more favorably by a larger share of Republican voters. It's not just the blue-collar, non-college, white voters. He actually has a nice cross-section of voters that he's winning support over. The other thing is Trump's base of support, if you look at the maps and you look at some of the detailed analyses, it's not just the most conservative parts of the country. It's in Reagan Democratic territory, Michigan, upstate New York, blue-collar towns across the Northeast and the Midwest, where Trump actually polls among the strongest anywhere. So this notion that if Trump wins, that's why he's doing so well in New Hampshire, in fact, that New Hampshire is a moderate state, but he's winning 35% or so of the vote. So Trump is not just a Southern phenomenon or a phenomenon of the most deeply conservative voters. He's winning a lot of different types of Republican voters. And if the moderate candidate, if a Marco Rubio or if a Chris Christie can't put a win on the board in the first 4 states, it's hard to see how anyone is going to really be able to consolidate support and run against Donald Trump or even Ted Cruz.
Talk to me about what happens if Donald Trump wins. Is there a winning national coalition that he can assemble?
I'm skeptical of that. You look at the poll trends in the last month. Trump's numbers have gotten better among Republicans, but they've gotten worse with Democrats and independents. And his overall numbers are the worst among all the Republicans running for a general election. I have a hard time seeing how someone with who inspires such strong feelings on either side, and who has made such divisive comments when it comes to minorities, to Muslims. I have a hard time seeing how that type of candidate can win a general election. One other thing, we haven't seen in this Republican primary the issue of his business dealings being litigated, and there's certainly there's a large trail of opposition.
But they haven't seemed to, when they do come to the fore, when they do get talked about, or when the inconsistency in his statements or the fact checkers show that it's a complete fabrication, something that he has claimed, they don't seem to stick. It appears almost that there's a will to disbelieve any criticism, which is a little frightening.
There's some of that, but let's remember what's remarkable to me about this whole nomination process is how little money has been spent on the airwaves with ads against Donald Trump in comparison to ads against Marco Rubio, Chris Christie. Chris Christie was never considered, once he started falling off, originally it didn't look like he was going to be a serious player, but as he started to rise, there's been a lot more money spent in New Hampshire with the super PAC ads, campaign ads against Chris Christie than there is against the front runner in New Hampshire, Donald Trump. Rubio, the amount of money being spent against Marco Rubio from all the different campaigns is a much greater than the amount of money being spent against Donald Trump. The law of political gravity still does apply. Negative ads do work, and there haven't been many negative ads used against Donald Trump for a whole host of reasons, but he's been able to stay above it all despite being the front runner.
And one of the main reasons they haven't been used against him is because the establishment, as much as they loathe Donald Trump, want his base, and they're afraid to alienate that base. And so that does create a conundrum for the Republican Party. What does this say about the creature the Republican Party created, this Tea Party birther and now Donald Trump, Sarah Palin movement?
Well, there's always been that energy in the last 6 years, the last 3 election cycles. But like in 2014, I wrote a piece on how Mitch McConnell, when he knew the Senate was within reach in 2013, and he knew that there were some very conservative, unelectable candidates running in primaries, starting with the Senate minority leader at the time and all the infrastructure of the so-called Republican establishment worked to fund, support, and even to criticize these supposedly unelectable candidates in Republican primaries. All the more electable candidates won, and Republicans won 9 seats to take back the Senate. Mitch McConnell survived his own primary that year. There's been no such coordination, organization, game plan among the Republicans, the Republican National Committee, Jeb Bush's super PAC, which is the best funded super PAC of all the candidates, has spent all the money, or like a good share of the money, against Marco Rubio, but not against the front runner, Donald Trump. So it's been a lot of these candidates feel like they need to win that established. The more moderate candidates feel like they need to be seen as the best moderate candidate before they can go after Donald Trump. They're looking at their own individual strategies versus the good of the party. But ultimately, it's stunning that we're here a couple weeks before the Iowa caucuses, and very little money has been spent against Trump. Lots of money among the moderate wing of the party has been spent against each other.
And I'm as confounded as you, and confounded as well that the networks are giving Donald Trump a free ride, to the extent where I watch CNN with a breathless announcement that a Donald Trump rally is about to start soon and we're going to go to it live. He has spent very little money in his own advertising, and virtually no money, I don't think any money. He's done some radio ads in opposition, attacks on opposition. Have we ever seen anything like this before, where somebody gets away with a couple $1 million spent, period, and is at the 30% range in polling?
No, I mean, it's remarkable that the amount of money spent this year has a negative correlation with how they're doing in the polls. And
the ones who spent the most are scoring the least, and Donald Trump is doing the best. It's
remarkable. And now Trump has benefited, like you said, with all this free media. In fact, we did at the hotline sort of a back of the envelope calculation. Just looking at how much airtime he's gotten compared to the other candidates. How much would that be worth if you actually bought ads for that amount of airtime? We're talking billions and billions of dollars. So that is valuable, and all publicity can be good publicity, and Trump has taken advantage of that maxim. But then you do have to. He is appealing to, like, you've spotted a real constituency within the Republican Party. But the question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Trump was not polled when he entered the race. He was polling in the single digits. He then got loads of free media coverage, and then he became the front runner, and he continued. News organizations continue to cite his front runner status, as they should, to continue giving him that level of coverage. So, it's kind of a question of, did the media create Donald Trump, or did Trump take advantage of the media?
If he loses, does it burst the bubble?
It takes a little bit of air out of his sails. Okay. If he loses, Iowa is a very important state for both Cruz and Trump. I think if Trump loses Iowa, and he talks about his, how Trump talks about his polls at every possible campaign stop, being a loser is not a sign of strength in Trump world. So I do think he would lose momentum in New Hampshire, but I still think he would have a good constituency in the New Hampshire primary.
What intrigues me is the businessman Donald Trump, who had a brand. That brand has now been transformed. I mean, how does he lose, if he loses the nomination? How does his business brand reconcile itself to the loser instead of the winner?
Well, it's even now, when he looks like a success politically, he's had to forfeit ties with Macy's, with his neckwear and other companies. There was, especially early on in the campaign. I mean, the Trump brand is as good as it's ever been when you're within striking, when you're leading in almost every poll in the race for the presidency, at least for the nomination. I mean, it's nothing but good.
And there's no second act, though. That's my question. If he loses this, I mean, there's no second act for Bernie Sanders either. I mean, there was for Hillary Clinton in 2008. Does he come back in another, not to run again, but what is his persona? This is the guy who cannot lose. He's always won. This is the claim that he makes. And I just wonder how it plays out in terms of his self-branding.
Well, look, even if he doesn't win the nomination, he's going to be a player at the convention. Yeah. I mean, he's not going to be going silently into the night, no matter what happens. So I actually think he's still going to be a force in this political campaign, even if he doesn't win the nomination. And there's going to be a primetime speech in Cleveland that the RNC is going to have to give to Donald Trump.
We will see how this plays out, but it certainly is something that was not going to be a contest on both sides, is becoming a contest. And there's a lot yet to see play out. I mean, we may see an establishment candidate emerge, and that would change the dynamic completely.
The notion of a Bush-Clinton general election couldn't be further away from the
That
from the
one's not
reality.
going to happen, but I think we may see, we may see some ups and downs before this is over. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Thanks, Jim.
And that's all the time we've got for now. For more information, you can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA or check out the website at aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week on Viewpoint.